Today on For What It's Nerd, we are going to discuss Devil Wears Prada 2. But before we get into that, let's quickly discuss both the Resident Evil trailer that dropped this week, as well as the ending of Maul Shadow Lord. So, first off, very briefly, the Resident Evil trailer looks really good. I'm excited to see it. It's another horror movie on the list where typically I watch none, after Clayface, of course, which we discussed last week. And I'm really excited to see how that kind of goes. I am a Resident Evil fan in theory. I've played one game fully, but I want to play the others, and it's always something that I want to do, and I'm intrigued in that universe. So I'm excited to see how this movie goes. Obviously, I'm aware that previous adaptations of the franchise have not always been great. This one is meant to sit within the continuity better than some of the other stuff, but people are concerned that there are some continuity issues already, so we'll see how that goes. But I will probably be sat for that later this year, so keep an eye out for a review on that as we get closer to that. Maul Shadow Lord, let's quickly go over that. I'm aware as well, by the way, guys, that The Devil Wears Prada is not necessarily doesn't really cross over much for these other things that we're talking about regards people's interests, but I like to try and keep everything within one episode as possible, where possible. Maul Shadow Lord, let's discuss that. So I don't think any of this show has been untelegraphed to me. I think everything that's happened in every episode of this show has been predictable, and not necessarily in a bad way. It's just the way this show has been predicated for season one. I think anything that happens there, like after now, is kind of like more open to interpretation. There's more ways it can go. But since we started to know the premise of season one, I think we knew where it was going to end up, and it did. You know, Vader showed up. We had Daki die. Lawson looks like he's dead, though I think he's probably going to come back. And I don't think Rook is dead either, if I'm being completely honest. But, you know, those core principles, the Inquisitor showing up, Vader showing up, Maul escaping, Devon becoming Maul's apprentice, was kind of like they were already kind of set in stone as I saw it. So some of the things along the way, yes, have arguably been augmented slightly. I think one of the big tragedies is the loss of Spybot in these episodes. But overall, I saw where this was going. Still, that does not mean that the show is not great. That does not mean that the show is not amazing in its artistry. That does not mean that I didn't enjoy watching every episode. I did. But I want to see where season 2 goes, and I hope it's a little bit less predictable than season 1. That's sort of my quick review on Maul Shadow Lord, the finale. And now let's talk about the big piece, that, of course, being the Devil Wears Prada movie, Prada 2. And as you guys have probably seen by the thumbnail for this video, it did disappoint me. And what I mean by disappoint me is not because I think it's a bad movie. I've seen objectively worse movies. I've seen less intriguing characters. I've seen less worthwhile stories to tell. We've all had that. I would argue, even still go and watch this movie, it's a good popcorn movie. But it is not The Devil Wears Prada. And what I mean by that is it is not the same bite. You know, I think that's part of the plot. And I will acknowledge to that to a degree, but there's a lot of more. This movie doesn't do the big betrayals that the first movie did. This movie doesn't hit the same emotional rending moments of change and life and trying to decide what path to take. It kind of plays it all a little bit more for laughs. It plays it all a little bit more victim of circumstance. It plays it a little bit safer. And the end point is largely, for most of the characters, unchanged from the beginning of the movie. The only one being changed is Andy. And actually, I think that's very ironic, because Andy ends up in a place where she's sort of less powerful than she was at the beginning of the movie. But I don't think it's actually about Andy, this movie. And I think that's why I think this movie is framed wrong. And I think that's probably the most disappointing part for me. This movie, so the first movie is about the morality of picking a job, and do you lose yourself to that job, and do you lose yourself as a person if you pick that job, and are you actually following your dreams? That's kind of like movie 1, right? Movie 2 is more about, in my head, obsolescence. And that's why I think this movie would have been better framed from Miranda Priestley's perspective, because the movie is about the industry declining. And obviously that plays into Andy's story as well, losing her journalist post at the Vanguard. And but it's also what's happening to Runaway, right? Runaway is losing its following. It's no longer a magazine. It's online articles. It's clickbait. It's all that type of stuff, right? It's content creation, ironically. And the movie kind of goes into this idea of cutbacks and consolidations and using AI and like not even checking your sources and puff pieces and saying what's something louder than saying something true and all that type of stuff. That's what this movie is trying to talk about. And it does some really good moments with that, actually. There's some really good speeches within this movie that I think are like still very good Devil Wears Prada-esque content. But it just feels like because they still revolve the story around Andy, when Andy had her resolve, she had her life, she kind of pushed through what the problems that she had, and they kind of had to retrack all that in this movie to give her story. I think I would have rather had, for example, Andy come in, and as Andy comes into this movie, the story flips to show Meryl Streep's Miranda Priestley's side of that story, and you have it be where she feels threatened by Andy coming in because Andy's this kind of like another shake-up, another thing that's changing. Is she in control? She doesn't get to have control because Andy is being given certain controls to get this paper back on the magazine back on track, and you could have had that story go into place. And then as Irv dies later in the movie, you could have of course, spoilers, apologies. I can't really talk about this movie without spoilers. As Irv dies later in the movie, you could have Miranda kind of gain some power back. And does she try and manipulate with that, or does she try and or does she kind of understand where Andy's coming from now and tries to work alongside that? But there's another party that comes in regards to Irv's son. I've got to say as well, by the way, and this is a side point, but it does link to this. All of the side characters in this movie were utterly forgettable. There's side characters in the first movie that like at least had a little bit of like okay, you understand where they're coming from. They give advice to Andy about Miranda. They build up Miranda's persona, or they for example, I think very much of Serena at the desk with Emily in the movie and talking about Andy, and the kind of like the bitchy atmosphere is like sort of like that makes sense, you know. Yeah, I think this movie would have been so much better framed from the obsolescence standpoint, talking about the idea that, you know, there's even this big speech about Rome and the Roman Empire falling, and we take parts of what's left, but things largely move on, and that's what humans are. And like, there's so many actually really good moments about like the human constitution is the wrong word, but what humanity is and what we take, like what's art and what's not art. And like there's actually so many good points in this movie. I will preface this by saying it was very upsetting to see an AI ad for using Devil Wears Prada. Like so there was an AI ad before the movie played that was about like asking about Devil Wears Prada, which was basically promoting the movie but also promoting AI, which I didn't love. But the movie itself does not do this. The movie kind of detracts from that. And in fact, there's a lot of conversation online at the moment about the fact that there was an AI looking picture in the movie, but it was actually drawn by an artist. And so like there's this idea that this movie is very much trying to be artiste, so to speak. But yeah, I don't know. I think there's so many good points in this movie, and it's nice to see Miranda reflect on some of the wrongs she's done and try to put them right. And it's nice to see some of the kind of the heartache of the first one resolved, but I feel like there wasn't enough heartache thereafter. This world is meant to be cutthroat. This is meant to be dog eat dog. That was always the point. And it's not, yes, the industry's changed regards the how do I put it, the political correctness, and I don't mean that in a bad way, by the way. That's obviously addressed in the movie as well. Yes, that's changed. Yes, it's changed regards HR violations. Yes, it's changed regards, you know, so many other things. But do people change? You know, are people just more sly in how they approach these things? You know, Miranda makes comments to these things still, and there's a kind of like a no, you can't say that type of stuff, and like you see her struggling with the change in the workforce. But I know, and I think a lot of you guys will know from previous jobs, etc., that just because HR says something shouldn't happen does not mean it doesn't happen behind closed doors. And I think having some of that original cattiness shown in a more sinister, underlying way would have really elevated this movie. I also want to talk about the Emily plotline in this movie, which I think was really dismaying because I love Emily Blunt. I do not think Emily, the character, added much to this movie at all. In terms of the character itself, obviously, we enjoy seeing that character interact with the characters. But the fact that they put her at Dior, and then that was sort of like contrived into the plot a number of times, was weird to me. It felt like every time she showed up, it was like, well, why is she here? Why is she involved? And I get that, like, it's this big event, and that obviously these other brand ambassadors and or like people who work with the brand will be there too. But it just felt weird to me. It didn't feel to like it really coalesced with the rest of the movie, and the betrayal that happens regards Emily's character with Miranda's doesn't feel fully baked because it wasn't there from the start of the movie. It was sort of happens halfway through, and you don't know how that kind of ever came to be. Like if there was some kind of implication that was going to happen way at the start of the movie, it would have been fine, but it didn't, and I don't know. I didn't like that either. What I would argue is probably would have been the better pitch in my head, and this kind of falls into everything we're talking about. So that in the movie, Irv dies and Elias Clark is being consolidated. What I would have done, personally, I wouldn't have introduced Emily up until that point. And obviously there's other things I would have changed about the movie as well, but I wouldn't have introduced Emily until that point at the funeral, and I would have introduced her as being, she's under one of the other publications. Like, let's say it was something that wasn't really her interest or wasn't really her goal regards moving up the ladder, but she's now editor-in-chief of one of the other publications that Elias Clark holds. And we find out the same thing, that Miranda forced Emily out, largely because she felt threatened. And what you find out is that they're now both vying for this new role, because some of the publications are going to be consolidated into a lifestyle magazine, for example. It's not going to be Runaway anymore. It's going to be Lifestyle or something like that. Like let's say Emily was under like the kind of the cooking brand, because for example, if anyone knows Condé Nast, which Condé Nast is the it was the brand that Vogue's under, and obviously so was Bon Appetit, and there was a lot of scandal around that. I think that would have been a really cool way to kind of add to the movie, because if you guys don't know about that, there was a lot of pay differences between that cast and between those guys making that content online. And Claire Saffitz, for example, who I think it's Claire Saffitz, she has her own channel now on YouTube, but does loads of like cooking based stuff, and did the kind of like making the gourmet versions of like sweets and stuff, and it was a really cool series and stuff. So I think like if they kind of went that angle with it and kind of added some scandal there, it could have been really fun. It could have been a really cool angle. And then you get this kind of idea that they're going to try and merge these magazines into a lifestyle magazine. And so Emily Blunt's character, who's the editor-in-chief of one part of this potential merger, and then Miranda's, who's the other part, and you have this kind of vying for power. And then however that ended up being, it would have been better because there was more tension, more stress in the movie, more stakes in the movie, and it was sort of would have mirrored the first movie with the betrayal of Jacqueline a little bit better, because the betrayal in this movie felt forced and it felt kind of washed over, and very much it was there and it was gone. But I actually think also the movie would have been more powerful if Miranda had made a change in her life rather than staying the same at the end. She's not wholly unchanged. She recognizes the flaws in what she's done to get to where she is, and how much of her like children's life she misses, and she talks about that. But I think the movie played it too safe. I think it was too referential. It cared too much about being a supplement to the Devil Wears Prada 1 rather than being the Devil Wears Prada 2. And also, I think too often was it, how do I put it? It was too busy being that to be its own movie. And I'm not saying it does have plot, and it does have good moments. And I think regardless of the plot, seeing these characters again after so long was just great in and of itself. And there's some great lines, but I don't think it's as iconic. I don't think in 10 years' time people are going to be referencing lines from the Devil Wears Prada 2, sadly. Maybe some, but like not in the same way. There's so many lines in Devil Wears Prada 1 that just are kind of in the cultural consciousness. And I don't think that's happened with Devil Wears Prada 2. That said, box office wise, it did really well. And we're probably going to see a Devil Wears Prada 3. If I'm being completely honest, we probably will. If they can make that a movie that is better able to stand alone and has a little bit more conflict and has a little bit more of that bite that the original movie had, I'm all there. And in fact, I'll probably be there regardless, because there's certain characters that you like regardless of how do I describe it? It's like Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, right? And I know this is a very weird analogy for some people, but Ewan McGregor's portrayal of Obi-Wan Kenobi is one of the shining beacons of the prequels trilogy. Even though people like those movies, they're not phenomenal. But because the performance was good. I don't disagree that I liked all the characters in this movie, and I liked seeing them again. And I teared up at a few scenes, and I think some of the reconciliation in this movie was good, and I think it was nice to see. So would I watch the third one? Yeah. But I think compared to the first one, which I think was, how do I put it? I think the first one is actual cinema. And I don't mean that in yes, a little bit the absolute cinema sort of way. And I think this second one is a little bit more popcorn. And I don't mean that, again, that's not to be derogatory to the movie and not to be derogatory to what the movie does. But I feel it was just a little bit more like, it's not even about cash cowing. It's not about, this wasn't, I can tell everyone who worked on this movie loved the original, and I can tell they wanted to elevate it to the 20, like sort of like the new era. I was going to say the 21st century, but they're both in the 21st century, into the new era. But I think the point of that first movie, the gut wrenchingness, the impossible odds, the brutality of Miranda was lost in this movie a little bit. And so because of that, it didn't hit as well. And so I don't think the first movie felt like an expose. This feels again, I would argue it's sort of an expose on like how bad bosses can be and how demanding people can be of you, and how you deal with that. And do you continue on that path, or do you stand up for yourself and move to the side, or move away, or get out of there? And this movie kind of a little bit backtracks on that in a way that doesn't feel, it feels, I hate to use this term, it feels slightly corporate, just ever so slightly. But again, I enjoyed it. And would I watch a Devil Wears Prada 3? Yes. I just think this movie could have been so much more if it moved into that idea of obsolescence, if it moved into that idea of who are we anymore as people and as like artists and as fashion. And like the fashion was also very lacking in this movie. There wasn't much focus on the fashion, which the first one, that was quite a lot of focus. Anyway, that's another point. And I think I've kind of given you my general overview of the movie and what I think and where I would go with it and stuff like that. So let me know what you guys think. I know some people would disagree with this just based on the fact that they are excited that these characters are back. I'm excited these characters are back. And I know some people will think that this movie was healing in a way. And I think I can agree. I think it's nice to know that potentially down the road in another 20 years' time, I could meet someone that I sort of met 20 years ago, and we could have some sort of reconciliation. That's a cool concept, and I do think the movie does that quite well. I do think the level of regret that Miranda faces is an interesting part of the story, but I think there should have been more to get to that point, and there should have been more of a link to the old story in a way of like, I think Nigel should have been more bitter. I think Andy should have been a little bit more confrontational and more confident in herself. I think Emily being totally changed regards where she works and stuff just didn't work for the story, etc., etc. So there's things to take away and things that people might agree or disagree with, as per usual with this podcast. But that's my opinion, that's my thoughts, and maybe you guys share them, maybe you guys don't. I don't know, but it's nice to have it's nice to have another Devil Wears Prada movie, regardless of the kind of the small intricate moment that the small intricacies that I would change within the movie, if that makes sense. So, yeah, that's all for this one, guys. I hope you guys have enjoyed, as always. Thank you for listening and watching. And I'll see you guys next week for a discussion on the finale of Daredevil. Bye, guys.